judging their backgrounds. But here we go.
Can you hear me now, everybody? Is it okay?
No, no. I mean, I can't make this the slideshow.
It's okay. I'm now on my other machine. So
yeah, that's good. My machine can't do a slideshow because I think the PowerPoint just my current power my old PowerPoint just doesn't tally with.
I'll just try that it's working. So you should now be able to can you see my PowerPoint now?
Yeah.
Splendid.
Okay, great. So I think Nick has started recording. So over to you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Whenever you're ready.
I will just stop the share for the time being because it's coming in a second. Right. Sorry about that, everybody. The wonders of technology, but Ibby's little introduction was precisely, in fact, where I was going to start. Because like many of you, I'm sure you might at first find not only Hingeston's music slightly strange, but also the famous duets for two bass viols, which I think need a little bit of work. And only recently with a friend in Glasgow, a fellow bass viol player, that I got back to the Hingeston one and made me wonder about how one can put them in context. Now, I'm a historian by trade and not a musicologist, so I will not venture into saying very much about the music or the details of the music. Instead, I wanted to look at the context in which they worked and the information that we might glean from relevant and related but different sources about what they went through. My point being that John Hingeston and Matthew Locke were both present in London in the probably from the late 1640s and certainly in the 1650s. And that raises some very interesting dimensions about their experience at a crucial stage in their career. As with most other composers, we have very little information directly from them. You know, we know, for example, that Laws got killed in the Royalist cause, but we have almost no personal evidence, any letters or anything that can help explain what sort of an individual he was and what he did other than writing the music. With Jenkins, we have, for example, Roger North's famous memoirs, but Roger North wrote those as an old man long after Jenkins had died. And as historians, at least, we always worry about memory. And I'm not speaking personally, but simply for the fact that, you know, when you recollect something at the end of your life, you may well have a different impression of reality. So I wouldn't put too much faith in Roger North's account, even though they seem perfectly plausible. There are other composers that lived through the Civil War period, including, of course, Christopher Simpson, but he is virtually invisible, as far as I know, until he published his Division Viol in 1659. Although his music suggests that he is very much engaged in the Restoration musical scene, we still lack almost all personal biographical information about him. I'm hoping that I gather there may be a forthcoming edition of Simpson's Music and Musica Britannica, and perhaps we'll find out more from there, but that remains to be seen. So instead, I adopted what I probably am, more familiar with, an approach looking at the context in which they worked. I want to argue that the huge controversies in politics and religion and governance in the later 1640s and 50s were so dramatic that no one working in London, at least, and probably in many other places, could possibly have avoided being personally affected. This is the most unstable and the potentially most violent period in English history, or in British history for that matter. And if you were in London, as we can see from all accounts, and I hope to demonstrate, you simply could not avoid taking some sort of position in respect of things going around you. I'll come to that in a minute. The reason why Locke and Hingeston are central to my talk today is, of course, that we know that Locke's 12 pieces of two bass viols was written in 1652, and therefore is directly relevant to what I'm talking about today. His broken consorts and his little consort, published in 1656, are similarly written in the context of what was going on around him. And although much of his music seems relatively light-hearted, especially his broken consorts and little consort, there are nonetheless suggestions in, for example, his four-part consort, that there was a lot of substance below the surface, as it were. You can start imagining things, but that's not what I want to do as a historian, of course. So, although we don't know very much about what Locke was doing in London in the 1650s, we do know that he had a hand in a number of stage works. We know that he had contact with John Playford, the publisher. We also know that after 1660, after the Restoration, he became a court composer with a role in the new violin band, and as an organizer of church anthems, a composer of church anthems, and as an organist. So he clearly had good connections in the right places. And this is interesting because we assume that he's a Catholic. There's some evidence to suggest that. And we also know from his later life that he was quite a difficult character to get on with. He seems to have been both vain and cantankerous, according to some of the accounts that we have from the time. And famously, towards the end of his life, he got involved in some very brutal controversies, quarrels about the reform of music. This is 1672 to 73, where he appears in print. And I'll come back to the whole print dimension in a minute. Peter Holman's book on the 4 and 20 fiddles will give you some context of the fiddle music side of things. But of course, I'm primarily here to talk about his viol music. John Hingeston is an even more interesting and potentially a very central figure in this, because he was employed directly by Cromwell. He was in effect a master of music to Oliver Cromwell. And yet, after 1660, he quickly gained prominence in the Restoration monarchy. In other words, he managed to make the transition, which is quite an achievement. I'll come back to that in a second, but I think being able to have been directly in Cromwell's household and then also to be accepted by Charles II suggests that Hingeston either was a lot better than we perhaps sometimes give him credit for as a composer, or a great deal more skilled as a diplomatic negotiator. Because in fact, he ends up writing a lot of music in the Restoration period. He also ends up, as Lynn Hulse demonstrated many years ago in an article, which I checked out, and it's now 40 years old. That's one of the big bits of research done on Hingeston. I was, alarmed to see that it is still one of the key reference points to Hingeston's music and his context. Now, I think we can all agree that his 4 suites for 2 bass viols are uneven, should we say, in quality. 3 of them, at least, are really rewarding things to play. We can also, I think, if you've dipped into his consorts for anything between 3 and 6 viols with the organ, we can see something that is actually quite innovative. It doesn't go easily with some consort players I know, but I do feel that there's a lot more there. And in a sense, if you take away anything from this talk, I hope it will be that you will go back to your Locke and your Hingeston and actually try them out again. I hope that what I say tonight might give you a little bit of some sort of sense, a feel of what he's up to. Now, one major note of warning. No one, and I certainly wouldn't, no one would argue that knowing about a wider historical context is necessary or even directly helpful. I'm not suggesting there's any cause or an effect in that Hingeston living through as master of music to Cromwell, living through the Commonwealth period, would have somehow written this out in his music. It's very, very rare for us to find any direct and explicit link. I'm thinking of, for example, what we find in Tomkins' Pavan for These Distracted Times. That is a piece of music that was clearly written on a specific occasion. And unfortunately, we can rarely say anything of this kind with regard to Locke and Hingeston's music. But there's enough of it around from the 1650s for me to, I think, argue that at least we ought to know a little bit about what they lived through, so that we have some sort of sense of the kind of ideas and the kind of problems, major problems, it has to be said, that they experienced. And I'll illustrate what these problems are. I'll go through them with some material that I hope you will find interesting. But before I do that, let me also point out that if you are thinking of comparing Locke and Hingeston, it is perhaps worth bearing in mind that according to Linhulst, at least, he ended up as being a much more successful composer, whatever standards you use, in his later life than was Locke. Locke fell out with a lot of people, but Hingeston, as Linhulst made clear, ended up a really quite rich man. He had 4 London houses and a fair amount of property. So he seems to have, had a reputation which is actually that of a very generous and kind-hearted soul. I'll read you a little quote from Pepys when I come back to Locke and Hingeston at the end of the talk tonight. And by some standards, at least, he seems to have navigated this very troubled time more successfully, I would argue, than Locke probably did. Whilst we are on comparisons, I would also like to suggest a few more comparisons that we need to bear in mind. One is that I'm afraid I would like Cromwell to be reconsidered, revisited. In some circles, Cromwell has had a pretty bad press. I think it might surprise you, if you're that way inclined, to know that he was actually quite a jovial character. He liked to have a tankard of beer and to sit around listening to music. And so you can imagine your evening at Cromwell's house, if you dared to get there or dared to go in, with Hingeston's music going on in the background. And I don't think it's too fanciful a flight of the imagination to think of the 3, 4, and 5, and 6-part viol consorts with organ as being performed by Hingeston, who was, of course, known as a viol player and as an organist, in Cromwell's household. In other words, Hingeston ends up being in a position that is quite similar to other court musicians during a period when England was a monarchy. I would also like to add, just to wind you up a little bit, perhaps, that Charles II, the Restoration monarch from 1660, is a great deal less competent than Cromwell was. In other words, the Restoration period marked a phase which most historians regard as one of pretty close to chaos and a level of corruption that bears perhaps some comparison with the current British government that we have. In other words, it was a monarch who really couldn't be bothered to rule well, couldn't be bothered to make the effort. And famously, this will again come out in a quote that I will use later on, he more or less bankrupted the English monarchy by the late 1660s, beg your pardon. So if you're wanting to compare the two, I would like to suggest that Cromwell is not the worst employer that you can imagine, whilst by contrast, Charles II is a pretty difficult character. And I'd like to emphasize this in terms of Charles II's very vindictive attitude towards those that had been involved in, or contributed to the Commonwealth period. Not only did he systematically organize agents to go around Europe to assassinate or bring back live anybody who had been involved in the regicide, in other words, signed his father's death warrant. That perhaps is understandable as a kind of revenge, but that does not explain why Charles II also viciously prosecuted Henry Vane, who was not a regicide. He had been an interesting and very important member of the political establishment right through the Civil War period, but he had not actually caused any direct personal insult in the way that Charles II seemed to regard the regicides as having done. Henry Vane was brought to trial in the early 1660s, not on any reasonable charge at all, but more or less under instructions to the judges to find him guilty because Charles, as he put it, wanted rid of him. Now that suggests a character who really required a great deal of careful handling. And for Hingeston, therefore, to have managed to make his peace coming from Cromwell's employment directly into employment at court is an extraordinary example of, should we say, adaptability. One thinks of, for example, Tallis surviving 4 different monarchs in the 16th century, all of whom had a different religious view. And as you know, Tallis was very careful never to let on what his own religious views were. So I think there's some interesting issues here. And my final general point before I get into the details of what actually happens in the 1640s and 50s is to remind you also of the extraordinary religious fundamentalism that plagues these years and continues to plague England right through to the Glorious Revolution. By religious fundamentalism, I suggest, or I would argue, that we have a whole extraordinary range of various Protestant groups, sectarian groups, that fight amongst themselves just as much as they are hostile to the Catholic regime that they thought they were getting rid of. By that I mean Henrietta, the wife and queen of Charles I, was of course a French Catholic. So there were always fears in the 1640s of a Catholic takeover. So there's what I would call a quagmire of religious arguments going on during the 1640s and 1650s. And that shows up in one of the other things that we need to bear in mind, namely that during the 1650s in particular, all forms of artistic creativity were considered sinful. Theatres were closed as being lascivious. Public ceremonials were severely limited and often divisive, and music making had to be, by definition, mostly secular, because, as you probably know, the stricter Puritan and Calvinist elements in public life did not tolerate any kind of fanciful music in church. And we can see this in all sorts of contexts also in the Netherlands, and I can draw parallels with the Netherlands later on when it comes to discussion. So it is time for me to share the screen to give you a quick rundown on what we're actually dealing with, and I hope it'll work this time. No, that's not what I meant. That's certainly not. Where are we? Now you should now have, I hope, if my machine wakes up, full screen view, and you can still hear me, I hope so. Is that okay, Ibi? Are you getting the full screen picture?
Perfect. Perfect.
Good. Right. For those of you not familiar with the English Civil War, this is just a very, very quick outline of the sort of main events leading up to the 1650s. Namely, the king's direct encroachment on parliamentary leaders, which effectively started off the full-scale confrontation between parliament and monarch. Charles basically marched into the House of Commons on the 4th of January 1642, wanting to arrest 4 of what he considered treasonous members of the House of Commons. They, unfortunately for him, had got wind of this and were not there. So the king had to retreat with egg on his face, as it were, and very quickly left for Oxford, where he established his base. Then we get effectively the First Civil War, 1642 to 1646, terminating in a set of Newcastle propositions in 1646, which were meant to create a kind of compromise peace settlement. That didn't last, because Charles had, this is Charles I I'm talking about, not his son for the moment, Charles I had the habit of signing up to things and then simply ignoring that he had signed it. This had happened already on the Petition of Right in 1628, and the Newcastle propositions he promptly broke, even though he had signed them as a contractual agreement. During this period, the New Model Army, which is the one that brings Cromwell, Ireton, and Fairfax and others to prominence, and they also encouraged a kind of democratic structure within an army. It's difficult to imagine an army with a democratic structure, but the army councils, and I'll show you a picture of them later on, were ways of, as it were, communicating and perhaps even discussing issues of contemporary political significance between the officers and the rank and file. And the most famous of these we now have a detailed record of. It's known as the Putney debates, which took place in Putney in outside London, then in October, November 1647, and led to a most extraordinary set of documents that are commonly known or associated with the Levellers, because the Levellers were involved in the New Model Army and were activists. There were significant agitation, or agitators as they're called, in the New Model Army. And you can read them if you want to check out. There are 3 agreements of the people which are published, 1647 to 49, and which raise all of these issues. Then, of course, we have the famous clampdown on political action, with culminating in the Colonel Pride's purge of the House of Commons, which was basically the army taking a sort of military control of what was going on in the House of Commons, and imposing a solution which ultimately, because of the king's reluctance or refusal to accept any kind of parliamentary or army compromise, led to the trial and execution of the king. This is often known as the Second Civil War, that's 1646 to 48, and then we get the Third Civil War, also known as the War of the Three Kingdoms, which involved mopping up operations in Scotland, defeat of Scotland at the Battle of Dunbar, battles in Ireland that you're probably very familiar with, and of course the battle in Worcester in 1651. What you see now on the screen is the trial of Charles in January 1649. And I can probably wave my arrow around. That lone person in a hat sitting in the foreground with the back to you is Charles I. He had a defense counsel, but they were not allowed to speak on his behalf. He had to speak himself, and he promptly refused to engage with the judicial procedure itself. This is the non-purged members sitting as a commission that was supposed to be about 90 people, but in practice about 55 to 60 people sat in attendance, and there is Cook, who was the Attorney General in charge of the proceedings. As you can see, the emblems of state on the table in front of him. This trial, you must realize, is an absolutely extraordinary, totally unprecedented event. No state anywhere in the world had ever brought to trial a reigning monarch or a reigning head of state who had not been insane or for some other reason needed to be deposed. The normal practice, of course, until this time was simply to murder your monarch. There's plenty of examples of that. But to bring a head of state to trial is really quite extraordinary. And it led to a lot of interesting discussions about what you could charge him with. I have the full charge sheet here, and I just picked out a few things about what the charges against Charles Stuart, as he's called, that is, of course, Charles I, seizing unlimited and tyrannical power. Well, that seemed a reasonable charge, given that he had refused to accept the signature on the contracts that he himself had engaged in. He had traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present parliament and the people he represented. Well, you could argue about that, but certainly there had been a civil war by this stage, in fact, 2 civil wars, by which cruel and unnatural wars, much innocent blood of the free people of this nation has been spilt. This is true, and you might want to know that according to relatively recent research, and I've discussed this with my fellow historians of this period, the casualty rate in the English civil wars was higher per capita than the death rate in the First World War. In other words, we're dealing with massive casualty rates on the battlefields, and of course from the disease that very often accompanied or warfare in that period. In other words, this is not a light affair. This is a genuinely a destructive and, one would argue, very cruel war. Laws is the most famous example that we know of, but there are literally thousands and thousands of other disastrous encounters of this kind, of casualties in the many encounters during the Civil War. Public pressure wasted, well, I've talked about that already, done for the advancement, now notice this final bit, advancement of a personal interest of will, power and pretended prerogative to himself and his family. Here we are into the central issue of what the trial was actually about. Namely, did Charles have any kind of sense of accountability to his subjects? To which a short answer is no, because he denied that openly. During a trial procedure, we have a day-by-day account, which of course was published by the survivors, i.e. Parliament, so one would want to add a pinch of salt to that. Nonetheless, it is a quite extraordinary document where you read with the Attorney General and the prosecutor begging Charles to plead. But because he thought he was God's lieutenant on earth, he refused to plead. He said, "I don't recognize your court." They then said, "Well, you were elected to be king." And he says, "No, I wasn't elected. England has never been an elected monarchy." In other words, he simply refused to operate the way one would have thought he might want to operate. And he refused to plead guilty or not guilty. And according to English law at the time, if you don't plead and you are accused of treason, the death penalty is unavoidable. So in a way, Charles had the last laugh, if you forgive me for using that rather macabre analogy, because he could now turn himself into a martyr. So we now get into the propaganda warfare, which is where I find a lot of really interesting evidence that I want to come back to in a minute, but I wanted to give you a few visual impressions first of all. This is Cromwell on the left, standing as ruler of the world. He's standing on the globe. And if you look, you will see the Royal Oak of Britain. This is a print to do with the execution of Charles. And you can see they're pulling down, his minions are pulling down, that's the story at least, the royal oak on which hangs Magna Carta, or the Bible. You can see a few other things hanging from a tree. In other words, Cromwell is being depicted as a destroyer of the whole of as you can see, Britain. That's one of the interesting uses of terminology. It really applied mostly to England. Charles, on the other hand, had already arranged for himself to be presented as a martyr before his death. And one of the most famous documents was a document, the authorship of which has been disputed, but which appears to have been the result of a discussion between Charles and his confessor, the Icon Basilicae, which is a text that went through innumerable prints. It was actually published within days of the actual execution. In other words, the execution that I just showed you. I should have commented on this picture. That is, of course, outside Whitehall. They built a platform, and if you look carefully, you will see the executioner holding the head of Charles there as his normal custom. So the beheading allowed Charles, in a strange kind of morbid way, to turn himself into a martyr. And that's what this print was partly designed to do. Who was beheaded before Whitehall, January 1648, as you can see. That's actually January 1649, but of course England was operating the old calendar still, so you will need to make allowances for that. Even more extraordinary is this picture painting, which is in the Museum of London. I had a recent conversation with David Hatcher, who pointed out to me that actually the head really was stitched back on. So I checked that, and yes, true enough. Charles was laid out in Whitehall, and before he could be seen, his head was stitched back on, and you can see the little red lines. This, as I think, must be the first attempted head transplant. You can see why he looks a little bit the worse for wear. But that, as an iconic image, is really, I think, pretty remarkable. And so what I want to get to, and that's really the core of my paper, is to give you some indications of the outpouring of printed texts. That is one of the key ways in which we can measure the reaction to all of these debates. The graph you can see at the moment is from George Raymond's Pamphlets and Pamphleteering, and it is simply a graphical representation of the number of printed items that appear in England through most of the 17th century. And no prizes for guessing. This is a civil war that I'm pointing at you, and 1648 is there where my arrow is at the moment. In other words, we literally have I'm sorry to use strong words, but what I think we can call an explosion in print. There were, on average, until the late 1630s, about 500 new titles. That's the line that's bumping along. 500 new titles produced per annum, nearly all of them in London, of course, because London was the main center of print. By 1642, we have 4,000. That is nearly a tenfold increase in printed output. That is the scale of public debate that is going on. And this is crucial for my argument because, you could not have been in London, I think, without recognizing what was going on or seeing coming across some of this. I already mentioned that the level agreements were published. There are all sorts of other interesting texts that were published. This is an unpublished newspaper, manuscript newspapers, and I think it's worth bearing in mind that these continue. Manuscript and print coexist in the 1640s. This is one of the interesting examples of how you would, basically a newsletter. Then we get a whole series of other competitor, and this time printed newspapers. This is relatively crude print, as you can see. The Mercurius Civicus or London's Intelligencer is basically a newspaper as we could sort of recognize it, mostly in narrative format, but it's perfectly straightforward to follow. And you can see immediately how the quality of print improved very drastically. And one of the interesting things about this is the way publishers and printers put a lot of effort into much shorter texts, because of course, otherwise they couldn't have suddenly increased the output by that amount. It's a number far more and shorter titles, and newspapers are not exactly a new invention, but they certainly gain a very firm foothold in England from this stage onwards. In other words, we have media of communication. And in case you thought I was exaggerating, this print is really quite extraordinary. I've just checked it out, and it is from 1641. The world is ruled and governed by opinion is a title, and you can see a man watering a tree in which sits a lady holding a globe and lots of documents. And there's a chap standing by, and there's a long verse that you could read at your leisure. Bits falling, texts, bits of print falling out of the tree. And just one last text that you might also find interesting. This is a printed notification that if you want to sign a petition, you can turn up at Wednesday morning on the 19th of July, 1643 at the Tailor's Hall to sign your petition. Now, this is an extraordinary way of amassing popular petitions. All persons of well-affected persons who desire a speedy end of this destructive war are entreated to meet at Merchant Taylor's Hall tomorrow, Wednesday, the 19th, 1643, at any hour of the day from 4 o'clock in the morning, if in case you start early, until 8 in the evening, and there to hear and subscribe a petition to the Parliament, etc. You can see how this is really a mass mobilization. And I find this extraordinary because, in effect, it is a result of the breakdown of government. Because we now have two governments in England, there's a parliamentary side and there is the monarch who's retreated to Oxford. Both sides felt obliged to try to explain themselves. And so they're having to go to a publication of a lot of documents which hitherto would have been regarded as confidential to government. You probably heard of the strange institution called the Privy Council, which apparently we have one even in Scotland, which of course, private counsel is what those words mean. In other words, it's business for the monarch and his trusted advisors only. Now, because there's a civil war ongoing, you are effectively invited to take part in whatever kind of public debates that you want to engage in. And just to give you a few illustrations of what this is or might amount to, I have a number of examples of printed text, but one that I'd like to particularly just give you a few quotes from. This is a religious text. It is a part of the product of the religious controversies that I was talking about earlier. And to give you some indication, this is a direct product of the Scottish Covenanting movement, penetrating right down to London, because Scots had, you probably know about the National Covenant in Scotland a few years earlier, which had also been triggered by Charles in essence. But of course, the Scots have a very different approach to their monarch and consider him as covenanting with God and with the subjects. The Scots were very worried about English Presbyterian compromise and demanded a whole lot of concessions on the religious side. This is Protestants arguing with other Protestants, you realize, simply about the nature of the monarchy. But in case you wanted to hear some vocabulary, I have a little quote here from a publication of Thomas Edwards, which I think gives certain indications of what was going on. This is from 1646, and the title has the splendid resonance of Gangrena, or a catalogue and discovery of many of the errors, heresies, blasphemies, and pernicious practices of the sectaries of this time. And in case you were really interested, he lists 176 such pernicious heresies, as he calls them, where other people have deviated by minute amounts from what he considered to be his definition of proper Presbyterian practices. Now, you might wonder why people waste their time on such ludicrously sectarian stuff, but he actually cited a whole lot of other preachers, including John Milton. I'll come back to John Milton in a minute. He's not a preacher, but one very much involved in the debate. And the kind of debate that ensued is illustrated by one vitriolic preacher who responded to being named in Thomas Edwards' Gangrena, saying Edwards's gangrenous epistle testifies by his going, writing, eavesdropping, his sending spies, emissaries, agents, and factors to pry into the haltings, failings, infirmities, and nakedness of his brethren, exposing them to a public sale, to the view of all men, even to his own shame. Well, that's the kind of language that you're dealing with. And if you want to expand your language of political vituperation, some of these texts are really pretty good. So my argument is I think, clear that you would have to be deaf, dumb, and blind to avoid the implications of some of these arguments. Now, if I were to summarize very briefly, I won't bother unsharing the screen because I have a few more images coming in just a second, so you'll bear with me. You can read that petition while you're listening. I wanted just to summarize what, as a historian, I would regard as the main bones of contention in this period. Instability and insecurity of everybody. In other words, basically a breakdown of government, and hence the greatest fear of all in the 17th century is when everything seems to break down, including family life itself. Secondly, the obvious and lack of credibility of any reliable political authority, in that Parliament was increasingly being outmaneuvered by the army, and Charles himself was, of course, more or less useless and had deliberately written himself out because he did not believe that any of his subjects had any right to tell him what to do. Thirdly, severe economic dislocation. And I have here for you a chart of the price of grain. This is wheat. The continuous line is a generational average, in other words, 31-year period average. But if you look at the actual grain price in between, this is the price of wheat on the London market. And this looks to me like very close to catastrophe. Because if the average price of grain is 32 shillings per quarter, by 1647, it is nearly twice. It is almost twice. Now, if you're living on a relatively straitened budget, it means starvation. And I think we need to bear in mind that in the later 1640s and again in the later 1650s, the economy was so unstable, not only in England, but also over much of Western Europe, including the Netherlands, that people starved to death. And that kind of threat is of a kind that, fortunately, very few of us have experienced in Britain. We are probably seeing it in Ukraine at the moment. It is pretty cataclysmic. So when we're talking about economic dislocation, wheat is actually the simplest way of measuring the instability of the economy, because wheat is the cheapest source of protein in England at the time. So it gives you some idea. With that, of course, is colossal social inequality. Social inequality, not just in terms of the instability of the law. I mentioned Henry Vane in 1662, but also terms of patriarchy, the persistent refusal to recognize gender inequality and do something about it, the only exception being the Quakers. And women Quakers are the only ones who are allowed to preach and the only ones who are given some degree of recognition as equal to the male part of humanity. So the ideas are there, but of course, most people refuse even to look in that direction. Extreme adherence to religious dogma, which I hope I've already illustrated well enough, resulting also in deep disagreements about biblical interpretation itself. And Cromwell, again, I'm not trying to defend him too much, but I think it's worth remembering that Cromwell is the first one to actually recognize religious toleration of a kind in his Instrument of Government of 1653, which is analogous to what his predecessor by a long step, Elizabeth, had done when she said, I will not look into men's minds. In other words, Cromwell in 1653 in the Instrument of Government allowed people some degree of religious flexibility, should we say. He's not a tolerant person, but just to rub this point in further, James Naylor, who in 1656 tried to ride into Bristol on a donkey in order to recreate the arrival of Christ in Jerusalem, was promptly arrested and would have been punished for heresy with a death penalty had Cromwell not intervened, and his sentence was commuted, not terribly nicely, I have to say, because he was bored through the tongue with a red hot iron instead to make sure that he never preached again. Those kind of details are the fabric of the 1640s and 1650s, and you can see why people are really very alarmed and very upset, and how you just couldn't avoid being sucked into some of these disputes. So apart from what the evidence, the visual evidence I've already presented, what other evidence do we have? And that's where I can return to one of my favorite haunts, which is as a historian of print in the early modern period. And I will just give you a few examples because I know time is getting on, and although we made a late start, I hope you can bear with me just for a few more minutes. Some of the authors will be very familiar to you. You will all have looked at John Milton, if you are well educated, at least in the English curriculum, John Milton of Paradise Lost. But what most people tend to forget is that he was already, by that stage, this is him writing the Paradise Lost in the 1660s, he was already a very experienced writer. In fact, when he wrote Paradise Lost, that was the only thing he could write because he had been charged with heresy himself. And as I've already made clear, heresy carried a potential death penalty. Now, for the greatest poet of the 17th century to be at risk of being executed by the Restoration government, notice, really takes some doing. But if you look at what he published previously, you can begin to understand. The Areopagitica of 1644 is the first text demanding freedom of expression. He had written some very aggressive criticisms of the Church of England, in the Reformation of England, the reason of church government. Then in 1649, he's actually brought on board by the Cromwellian government, or the very early Commonwealth government, as one of the main strategists and apologists for the new regime. This is after the execution of the king. In fact, he was already involved before that. So he wrote The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. And if I had time, can you bear with just a quick quote from The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates? I have it here at hand, just to give you a flavor of what John Milton was up to. And I quote, "If men within themselves would be governed by reason and not generally give up their understanding to a double tyranny of custom from without and blind affections within, they would discern better what it is to favor and uphold the tyrant of a nation." And so it goes on. What I called muscular prose with a vengeance. He then also responded to the Icon Basilicae that I mentioned a minute ago with his Iconoclastes. That's a very important text basically systematically dismembering the royalist argument for hereditary and what had in fact become absolute monarchy. He writes, The Defense of the English People. That's actually in Latin. I've given you the English title as it was translated later on, but that's one of his most successful publications because it was written in Latin and published for the European market, and it goes through a lot of editions. That's one of the ways as a book historian one can trace impact, because it is clear to everybody that you would not reprint a book unless you could sell it. Publishers, after all, are businessmen. And so when a book goes through a number of editions, we can be sure that it actually sold well. And this is, notice, sold across Europe. So it's not even a sponsored text the way the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates and Iconoclastes. They were sponsored by the English government. This one is, in some copies at least, are independently printed. So what I'm suggesting here is that we're dealing with a pretty strong apologist. And this is the title page of the first edition of the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates. You've noticed that he signed himself J.M. and somebody has penciled in this copy, I can't remember where I got it from, John Milton, that it is lawful and has been held so through all ages for any who have the power to call to account a tyrant or a wicked king, and after due conviction to depose and put him to death. The message is pretty clear cut and doesn't need any explaining. Now here I dug out a couple of copies that we have here in the University Library of two of his texts in later editions. This is both of them Iconoclastes, and the reason I brought them up is just so you can see the different formats. You'll see my blue pencil on the left-hand one is actually slightly smaller than it appears. The right-hand volume is a big complete edition of John Milton from 1697. And I put a measuring tape down the side of it in inches, the big numbers. So you can see it's a big folio volume, 12 inches tall, a bit more than 12. The one on the left is a small pocket edition from just a few years earlier, 1690. It looks like 1692, but it is actually 1690. Printed in, well, would you believe it, Amsterdam. Well, it isn't Amsterdam, it's actually London, but that's the way the print trade operated, because they had to be secret about it, because this is just after the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89. And the scale of it you can measure by my blue pencil, which is lying just by the side of it. Okay, I won't go into, keep you too long, but just a few more examples. Thomas Hobbes, John Warr, Needham, James Harrington, Oceana, and a number of other texts that if you start delving into the English short title catalogue, you can find all sorts of wonderful texts, which I've spent many, I was going to say hours, but it's actually months, almost years now, chasing up to try to see what the political debate is all about and what the social debate is all about. But I wanted to show you one. This is a title page from James Harrington's Oceana, the Commonwealth of Oceana. Notice a dedication to His Highness, the Lord Protector of Commonwealths of England, Scotland, and Ireland, that is Cromwell. So for Harrington, this is 1656, to produce a text to Cromwell. I can barely imagine that somebody as intelligent as Hingeston would not have caught on to this one, because it's dedicated to his employer. And you can hardly get more, as it were, creative in planning how England, Scotland, and Ireland might turn into a new utopia, because Oceana is a direct reference to utopia. If you get a chance, please do look at Harrington's Oceana. It's a wonderful creation of a new, not exactly communist commonwealth, but certainly a more leveling one. There's property restrictions, and there's redistribution of agricultural resources and all sorts of other interesting things in this one. And then finally, perhaps the greatest work in politics ever written in English, I would say almost ever written full stop, that's Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. And the title page itself is pretty extraordinary. This is it in front of you, where Leviathan, the huge sort of sovereign body, because that's what it is, with a sword in one hand and the religious symbol of the bishop's staff in the other. And those images are replicated in the military power of the state and the ecclesiastical power in the state. I will not quote you because I'm already overstayed my leave from Hobbes's Leviathan, but it really is an extraordinary text. I just give you a few, as it were, summary head points, key points. First of all, Hobbes evaluates human society without God. Now that is outrageous to nearly every clergyman in the world at that time. He engages with a detailed study of the Bible as a historical text, not as a word of God handed down, but as an accumulation of memories and stories by various people who compiled, especially the New Testament, but of course it also applies to the Old Testament. He then asserts the need for strong government, you can see why, sovereign body, but notice it's not necessarily a monarchy. He also makes a case for a sovereign body such as in Parliament. All authority is meant to be delegated to that sovereign body. And then he gives an outline of natural law, natural rights, collective consent, the covenant appearing again, and the equality of all subjects in relation to the sovereign. How that would work is perhaps illustrated by the Army Council. I remember, you remember, I hope that I mentioned the Army Council just a little while ago. This is one of them. The people in hats are the officers, the people who are respectful by not wearing a hat in the company of their superiors. Standing on the right of the picture are the ordinary rank and file soldiers. But to have a discussion round the table, and notice, of course, lots of printed pages on the table in front of them, and apparently also an ink pot so people can write down what is going on. This is a kind of democracy in the army, which of course Cromwell did not like and did not want introduced in the state at large. It's a kind of picture that I think reminds us that this is really quite a revolutionary world, a world which is difficult to understand except by reference to the background. And let me just finish off with a few rather more flippant ones. This is an attack on the Quakers. The Quaker's dream, or the devil's pilgrimage in England, being an infallible relation of the several meetings, shaking, shrieking, shaking, quaking, roaring, yelling, howling, trembling in the bodies. This is an attack on the Quakers as they were originally known. And in case you want to look at the pictures in more detail, notice they believe in free will. Good heavens, you can't have that. Walk answerable to religion within you. That's the inner light. Now that's very subversive. Be thou merry. Oh, heaven help us. If you're a good Puritan, you certainly wouldn't want to be merry. And above ordinances. And I really like this. They take their clothes off and there's a fiddler. And this is not just a figment of my frivolous imagination, because, and if you don't like explicit images, look away now. The next print is of an attack on the ranters. I don't think I need to make any further comments on that, except there's of course an image of somebody playing. I think it's probably not a treble viol held under the chin, but that would be my excuse for introducing this image. In other words, using direct sexual innuendos, which in fact were unjustified. The ranters did not engage in what you see in that picture, but this is a propaganda print about what happens if you let go of the rules and regulations. And I'll finish with that image of a Dutch. It's actually a Dutch, it's a bit of a cheat. I don't have a Dutch, an English image of what goes on, but at that point, I'll leave you with that. We can come back to that in a minute, and just come back to Hingeston and Locke, because that's where I started, and you're very patient. Okay, fine. Put it on.
I was just about to say that Nick should carry on recording, which he has done. So, because the questions can sometimes be more interesting than the, well, not more, I'm sure.
Well, I just have a conclusion before we get there, Ibby, if you don't mind. I just have a few points because I wanted to return to Locke and Hingeston before we finish. And I apologize, but it's partly because of the confusion at the beginning. Where does all this lead to us? Okay, Locke, I've already made clear that he was a cantankerous gentleman, at least be regarded as such, argumentative. And during the Restoration period, he is clearly involved in the king's private music. So he seems to have got back into favor with the king. That's what Peter Holman and others have argued. But my other point is that he would have been exposed to a lot of this kind of disagreement when he was writing the viol music. We know the viol music, we know that is datable from the 1650s, exactly contemporaneous with the material I've just been talking about. Hingeston too, and I wanted to finish off on the quote from Pepys's diary. This is Samuel Pepys's diary from 1666, which I think says something that we need to be reminded of. This is Pepys on the 19th of December, 1666. Then he says, he then to talk of the king's family. This is with Hingeston. This is Pepys actually meeting up with Hingeston. He says, many of the music, this is the music in the king's employ, are ready to starve, they being 5 years behind for their wages. I talked about Charles II's mismanagement, 5 years behind for their wages. Nay, Evans, the famous man upon the harp, having not his equal in the world, did the other day die for mere want, and was fain to be buried at the arms of the parish, and carried to his grave in the dark of night, without one link, without one candle. But that Mr. Hingeston met it by chance, and did give it 12 pence to buy 2 or 3 links. He says all must come to ruin at this rate, and I believe him. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor for questions. Anybody has questions, please?
Notice that the quote is from 1666, not from the 1650s. So things didn't improve at all, really, for the musicians.
Any comments at all or questions?
You're probably so deafened by what I've been saying.
I think it was so comprehensive, Thomas, and so eloquently delivered. I think you've got all the information. Everybody has understood and gained so much. They have no questions to ask.
Well, so while you're thinking, can I just mention that, my point at the beginning, that I'm not trying to say that all the events that I was describing are somehow reflected in music. That would be pure nonsense. And of course, as a serious historian, I don't want to suggest that there are simple connections, cause and effect, that we can argue. But perhaps to get you all going, could I suggest that the somewhat shorter phraseology of both Hingeston and Locke's music, their very often quirkiness and shorter, as it were, physically shorter. If you compare that with the music, the Fantasia suites of Jenkins, for example, who was well out of all this, living in his with his private patrons, Jenkins' music is much bigger in terms of arches, much bigger in terms of the architecture, far more profound in terms of harmonic development and so on. I do think there is a bit of a contrast between such great composers as Jenkins and Laws and what Locke and Hingeston are trying to do. Does that make any sense at all? You're still very silent.
I was just thinking how it's really an extraordinary time, and it's amazing that these composers were able to carry on working during all the turmoil. I mean, how were they able to survive? I guess in the big houses, I mean, were people exempt from fighting on either side, or what were the positions of the noble families? Do you happen to know that? I mean, how, for example, was Simpson able to be employed? I mean, in such difficult times, or Jenkins even?
Very interesting question, Ibi, and you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of disagreement amongst historians about which areas of England were worst affected. There's no doubt in my mind that London actually became relatively settled once Charles had left, because although there is a military occupation from General Monk in 1660, when he comes down from Scotland to prepare for the restoration, there was less, there's not actually fighting in London, but, Tompkins complaining about a cannonball coming through his house wall, and of course, some of the other very badly affected areas, I mentioned the casualty rate, it's very patchy. And I think, as far as I know, Jenkins' patrons were not directly affected. They were well enough out and kept a low profile. You obviously had to keep a low profile if you wanted to save your neck. On the other hand, a lot of people found that very difficult because, of course, Parliament eventually effectively pacified the entire English kingdom as it had been, and of course also marched into Scotland and subdued Scotland. So you're living under what some historians have regarded as a military dictatorship in the 1650s. And that might have created some degree of peace, but it's not a peace that everybody would be terribly happy about. So you're quite right. How do you survive in those contexts? I think in the case of Locke, as far as we know, he made a little bit of money from stage plays in the 1650s. Now that might sound ironic given that stage performances are banned, but apparently you could try it on in a private barn somewhere and hope that the soldiers didn't notice you until your play was over. And he did contribute, and we know from his publications with Playford that he actually managed somehow to keep going. But it would have been difficult. Hingeston would have been in a much more comfortable position because, of course, he was paid by the head of state, Cromwell.
But music making still went on, didn't it?
Yes,
at home.
absolutely.
And possibly even, well, I mean, it wasn't banned, was it encouraged? I mean, I'm just trying to remember a quote. It could be from a different period altogether, but it's something that it says about it being better to stay at home and scrape away or fiddle rather than be knocked on the head abroad. Do you know that quote?
I do know the quote.
On the head
I think it's from Roger North, is it not? Can somebody put me right? I think it's from Roger North, but it may be somewhere else. And absolutely, an obvious entertainment. I mean, who would want to forego an opportunity to sit and play with Jenkins in the household? Hey, I'd much rather that than join the army. But there's John just back again.
Yes, you're right. It was Roger North. It's also interesting, Joe Wainwright will tell us more about this, the sort of music that Cromwell enjoyed. I remember Italian motets being sung for Cromwell's entertainment. So a very different sort of music from the Puritan he appeared on the outside.
Yes. He's a man of many parts, and I think we are still struggling to get to the bottom of what Cromwell was really all about. I think he was actually a very efficient organizer, no doubt about that. He was clearly a formidable military commander, but I also think he has this, beer-swicking, jovial chap in the evenings, sitting around and listening to some nice music. And I rather like to think of Cromwell listening to Hingeston's Fantasias.
If I may say, John is absolutely right about Cromwell listening to, would you believe, Latin motets by Richard Deering. Richard Deering, who was Henrietta Maria's organist and a Roman Catholic. And apparently Cromwell had the organ from Magdalen College, Oxford, removed to Hampton Court, where he was living rather as a king. And there we have him listening with two boys, presumably Hingeston trained, performing Latin motets. They probably were not the Roman Catholic text, as it were, but they were more biblical Latin. But there you are. And I think that the big difference is, of course, that he was listening to this music devotionally, not liturgically. And I think, therefore, he was listening to this in a religious sense in his own chambers. But that really does sort of show the ambiguities of the age, doesn't it? That Cromwell listening to Latin motets by a Roman Catholic composer who worked for Henrietta Maria.
Thank you.
Speaking as a composer of both viol and orchestral music, I find what you've said quite sympathetic. Some of my works are a direct express a reaction to what has gone on. And I know for one of them, I begin to, oh, gee whiz, if the authorities listen to this, they might not like it.
I think it's worth remembering that Elizabeth I was, of course, of exactly the same. She was quite happy to have Latin text liturgical music published, provided it wasn't too explicitly or obviously Catholic. And I think it shows, people who actually appreciate the musical value, or the musical expressions of profound ideas that one might want to. So absolutely, yes. It certainly conveys a different image of what could be done in private. And I think that makes perfectly good sense. And there's no indication that Cromwell was anything other than much more broad-minded than you might read in the popular press, as it were.
Well, on that note, I think we've come to the end of the meeting. Thank you very much, Thomas, for that very informative and very eloquent lecture. Thank you to everyone for attending tonight's meeting, and I'd like to say special thanks to Nick for being our host this evening. I'm just chairing, but Nick has had all the controls. And we are looking for other people to host these meetings in the future in case I can't make the event. I almost couldn't make it tonight, but my plans changed at the last moment. So if you're interested to just be the person turning on Zoom and record the meeting, would be